Volume 2, Chapter 8 of Celestina. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Celestina by Charlotte Turner Smith. Volume 2, Chapter 8. The short remainder of the evening passed very unpleasantly to Celestina while she continued in company, for Montague, to whom she could not prevail upon herself to be rude, was yet so dissatisfied, either from the constraint he observed she wore towards him, or from her long conference with Vavasour, that he could not conceal his concern, and sighed so loud and so long as to attract notice and some very acrimonious speeches from his mother. Mr. Thorold, too, she thought, looked uneasy, and Arabella evidently disliked her more than before, while the captain's rude examination of her countenance, from which she always shrunk, was now more painful to her than ever. She got away as soon as possible, but was far, very far from finding repose in solitude. All that Vavasour had said now returned to torture her, and instead of finding sleep when she retired to her pillow, the same uneasy thoughts and harassing conjectures which had long rendered it of difficult acquirement, had now received such a reinforcement as made it impossible for her to sleep at all. She rose with the dawn of day, hoping she might in the course of it see Cathcart, and yet from him she had little to respect as to her removal, unless he could find for her some farmhouse in the neighbourhood of Jessie, where she might have board and lodging. But even to this scheme there were objections. It would be too near the Thorolds. The young men might still visit her, and the report still obtain which Vavasour had repeated to her, because, though Montague was really, she found, returning to Oxford in a few days, there would be other occasions of his being at home. It was also too near Alverstone, which, since she almost despaired now of seeing again with pleasure, she wished to escape seeing even at the distance from which she frequently beheld it. When the clump of firs and some of the high grounds in the park, conspicuous from almost every part of the country within 10 or 15 miles, often drew from her heart many a bitter sigh. About 8 o'clock she saw Cathcart enter the little lawn before the house, and immediately went down to him. He approached her with more than ordinary cheerfulness, but in answering her questions told her he had not heard from Mr. Willoughby. "I flattered myself you had," said Celestina, sinking again into dejection, "for I thought, Cathcart, you seemed unusually cheerful." "If anything could make me long so," replied he, "when you, my dear madam, and my noble friend are divided and uneasy, it would be the intelligence I have received about my sister, whose situation, you know, and my solicitude for her and her children, was indeed the only one Mr. Willoughby's goodness would have left me, if he had himself been as happy as he deserved to be." "And what then have you heard," inquired Celestina, "of Mrs. Elphinstone?" "That her husband, who has been long wandering about the world, is at length settled, in a very remote situation indeed, but one which he happens to like, and which is likely to become profitable. He is appointed to superintend the fisheries established by a society of gentlemen in the western islands of Scotland, and is already put in possession of a good house in the Isle of Skye. Thither my sister is about to follow him, but I have prevailed upon her to send to me her 2 youngest children, whom I shall put to nurse in some farmhouse where Jessie or I can visit them every day. The other 2 are as many as it will be possible for her to take care of, and when she is settled I have engaged to conduct the little ones to her. She has already received money from Elphinstone to enable her to set out well equipped, and waits only to see me before she takes leave of London, and she says she hopes for ever." "And when do you go?" "I propose setting out for London on Thursday. unless you or Mr. Willoughby have any commands for me that may detain me longer." "Alas, Cathcart," said Celestina, "I am afraid you will receive no intelligence of Willoughby by that time, but I can find, I believe, something for you to do for me which will rather expedite than detain you." Cathcart then assuring her how happy every opportunity of showing his gratitude would make him, Celestina said, "Well then, my commands are simply these, that instead of going on horseback, you come hither in a post-chaise on Thursday morning, and take me with you to see my dear Jessie, as I cannot go without having that satisfaction. And afterwards, Cathcart, you shall take me to London with you." Cathcart expressing some surprise at her resolution, she told him that she would account for it as they went, that Devonshire was at present very unpleasant to her, and that she fancied change of place would relieve her spirits more than all her reason and her philosophy, "which, to tell you the truth, Cathcart," said she, "may be accused of acting a little like Horatio. And I'm sometimes tempted to say to them, 'Is then the boasted purpose of your friendship to tell Callista what a wretch she is? Alas, what needed that?' But however, I find really, Cathcart, that I cannot here obey our dear friend in the points he most insists upon, those of keeping my cheerfulness and preserving my health, and I have a mind to try his remedy and ramble a little. Perhaps I may go to Scotland with your sister. Do you think she would admit me as a travelling companion?" "Admit you, dear madam?" said Cathcart. "Surely she would be but too much honoured. But you can never be serious." "It is, however, very likely that I may become so. At present my resolution is to take leave of this family and go with you to London. You will see Vavasour to-day, and you may tell him so." They then settled the hour at which the post-chaise was to be ready for her the next morning save one. Cathcart returned to Alveston, and Celestina to the house, where she proposed taking the earliest opportunity of acquainting Mr. Thorold with her determination. She considered herself rather as Mr. Thorold's visitor than the guest of any other of the family, and wished to have his approbation for the step she was about to take, without however assigning the reasons that actuated her to take it. She had frequently fancied of late that he saw more than he chose to notice, and that, though he was too generous to repent the friendly invitation he had given her, he was too prudent not to foresee ill consequences from her long continuing to accept it. In the midst of a large family, to which he was greatly attached, Mr. Thorold lived much of his time alone. His study and his parishioners divided the day, and, except at dinner and for about an hour afterwards, his wife and children saw very little of him. Celestina was uneasy till she had spoken to him, and therefore, when he rose to go for his walk after dinner, she inquired whether he would allow her to go part of the way with him, as she wished to speak a few words to him alone. Montague blushed deeply as she thus addressed herself to his father, who led her however out of the room, and taking her arm within his, in his usual friendly way, took the way towards the village street, where he had, he said, some patients to visit that evening, for he was the physician as well as the pastor of his people. After a few minutes of embarrassing silence on the part of Celestina, she collected courage enough to tell him that in consequence of some intelligence she had learned from Mr. Vavasour, she had determined to go to London. "Not under his convoy, I hope?" cried Mr. Thorold, eagerly interrupting her. "No," answered Celestina, a little startled by the manner in which he spoke. "Not by any means with him, or under his care, but with Mr. Cathcart, who is going on business of his own." "You know, my dear Miss de Mornay," said Mr. Thorold very gravely, "that my house and my best advice are equally and always at your service. You may have reasons for quitting the one and rejecting the other, into which were I to inquire it would produce for me nothing but mortification. I will not then inquire. I will only entreat you to consider well whither and with whom you go. Mr. Vavasor has, I apprehend, no mother or sister, and you cannot be ignorant that he has the character of indulging himself in liberties, which even in this age of freedom make him rather a marked man." "My dear sir," replied Celestina, "I have not the most distant idea of quitting your protection for one so little proper as Mr. Vavasor's must be, though he is the most intimate friend of Mr. Willoughby. But my meaning merely is—" "Come," cried Mr. Thorold, interrupting her, "I will explain your meaning, or rather the meaning of Vavasor. He has been talking to you about my son Montague. He has represented the impropriety of your listening to such sort of conversation as I know Montague has more than once entertained you with. Is it not so?" "I own it is," said Celestina in some confusion. "I do not blame him," rejoined Mr. Thorold, "and if his vigilance is the effect of friendship, I commend him. Nor do I, my dear ward, disapprove of your wishing to shun the boyish importunity of Montague. I only entreat you to reflect well on your removal, and to remember that notwithstanding Mr. Vavasor's intimate connection with Willoughby, I consider myself as having some claim to your confidence, and as in some degree answerable for your disposal of yourself." "You are very good, dear sir, and deserve, I am sure, my gratitude as well as my confidence. You deserve, too, that I should speak to you with the utmost sincerity." She then related to him all that Vavasor had said to her of the reports that had obtained relative to her and Mr. Montague, and concluded by saying that though she highly esteemed his son, and had the most grateful regard for the whole family, she could not listen to these reports without concern, because they might be displeasing to him and injurious to views he might have for his son, even putting herself out of the question. "I think, therefore, dear sir," added she, "that it will be better for me to put an end to my visit for this time, and to travel into the north with a sister of Mr. Cathcart's, who is going thither. Change of scene will relieve my spirits, and wandering give me perhaps a new relish for the beauties of Devonshire, where, believe me, I shall be most happy to return, whenever I can do it without subjecting my best friends, as well as myself, to uneasiness." "I am vexed," said Mr. Thorold, "that the romantic temper of Montague has made this removal necessary in your idea. He goes very soon to Oxford, indeed in a few days, and afterwards, perhaps, you would find my house less objectionable. As to the gossip of the country, you are, I hope, too wise to mind it, and I have long since learned to despise it. That, therefore, should not weigh with me at all. But in return for your charming sincerity, I will speak very plainly to you. Montague is a young man of good abilities and of an excellent heart, but the violence of his passions keep me in perpetual concern lest they should deprive me of all the happiness that I may hope to derive from such a son. And already I have twice, with great difficulty, delivered him from engagements he had made with young women quite unworthy of him, engagements which, though he soon saw the folly and impropriety of them, he fancied his honour obliged him to keep. Another, I know not who, one perhaps not much superior to these, as I learned by a friend who keeps a steady eye upon him, had succeeded to the imaginary possession of his affections when last he came home. I was uneasy at it, but perhaps considered my own feelings too much and yours too little, when I saw with pleasure his instant admiration of you. I encouraged it because I hoped that in learning what true merit was, he would hereafter be less liable to be misled by the poor semblance of it when aided by a pretty face or a slender shape. At the same time I thought I had sufficiently guarded him against any excess of attachment by representing to him your situation and convincing him it would be not only presumptuous but hopeless. I believe, however, from some late observations I have made, that I have judged ill, and to save him from maladies that might be trifling or curable, have exposed him to the severer misfortune of feeling a real passion where he can meet with no return." Celestina could not with sincerity disclaim what she had so much reason to fear was true. Affecting, however, to believe that Mr. Montague would soon lose the impression when she was no longer present, and would find many infinitely more worthy of his affection who might be proud to receive and at liberty to return it, she renewed the subject of her going to London, besought Mr. Thorold still to honour her with his friendship, and promised to return to him again in the winter if no objection should arise to his receiving her. She heard with gratitude the advice he gave her about Vavasour. "Do not," said he, "put yourself too much in his power under the idea of his being the chosen friend of Willoughby. He is called, and I believe is, a man of honour in the common acceptance of the term, but I am afraid there is little real honour among those who are in any respect so very licentious as Vavasour is said to be in regard to your sex. The style in which he lives among a certain description of women is not only the means of degrading all in his opinion, but hardens the heart while it corrupts the morals. And with all Vavasour's boasted honour, I dare say he is a man who, if he happened to take a fancy to the mistress of his friend, would steal her affections and her person without hesitation, and suppose that by an appeal to the sword or pistol to vindicate the wrong he had done, the action, however unprincipled, would derogate nothing from his honour." "Surely, sir," said Celestina, "Willoughby would not have so much friendship for Vavasour were he such a man?" "I don't know, my dear," answered Mr. Thorold, "that Vavasour is such a man, but you will allow at least that it is very probable; and as to Willoughby's friendship, I am afraid that is no criterion of merit. The college friendships of young men but let me not make you too much out of humour with the world, while I mean only to put you upon your guard against the evil with which it too often teems towards unprotected youth and loveliness. It grieves my heart to let you go, but, upon the whole, if you promise to write to me often, to remain with this sister of Cathcart's who is, I conclude, a woman of character, and to take no new course without informing me, above all, to keep yourself quite out of the power of Vavasour, and not to be introduced to any of his acquaintance by way of staying with them, unless you are very certain who they are, I say, on all these conditions I will not oppose your going, though it hurts me to consent to it." Celestina, having thus relieved her mind by explaining herself to her generous friend, became better satisfied than she had been for some time, and found at least an alleviation of the concern that preyed on her heart in the idea of change of place. She parted soon after from Mr. Thorold, whose business she was fearful of interrupting, and walked back towards the house, intending to open her intentions of leaving them to the rest of the family when they were assembled to their tea. Montague, however, who had never lost sight of her, but had followed her and his father at a distance during their walk, now hastened across the field she was in to meet her. His eagerly inquiring eyes were fixed on her face when he came up to her, but not daring to ask the subject of her conference with his father, nor able to turn his thoughts from it, he only said, "Well, Mr. Mornay, you've left my father?" "You see I have," said Celestina, smiling, "and I have left him well satisfied with the reasons I have given for quitting his hospitable roof on Thursday." "Quitting it!" exclaimed Montague, turning pale. "Quitting it! What are you going to leave us then, and before I go to Oxford?" "My good friend," replied she, "you did not surely suppose that I was to be a perennial visitor at your father's. I have now been here almost a month, and you must certainly allow that to be a very long visit from a person who, till within 5 weeks, had not the good fortune to be known to your family at all." "I know not," said Montague, sighing, "what I thought or what I supposed, but I would to heaven I could forget having ever seen you, as easily as I am convinced you will lose the remembrance of me." Celestina, with one of those fascinating smiles which lent such peculiar charms to her countenance, now assured him that he was mistaken. "Indeed," said she, "I shall always remember you all, with pleasure and with gratitude." "Well," answered he, "I thank you, and I thank you for not accepting me, and by putting us all together, showing that you have no particular favourite in the family, but that one is as indifferent as another. But, however, I wish you would not smile, for I cannot bear it." "Ridiculous!" cried Celestina. "I am amazed, Mr. Montague, that with your understanding you give way so frequently to such absurd fits of, I hardly know what to call it, a romantic style of behaviour which you seem to think women like, whereas I assure you that to me at least it is the most unpleasant in the world." "When did you ever see me in this romantic style, as you are pleased to term it, with any woman but yourself?" "I never did, because I happen not to have seen you with any other women than those of your own family. But you know that your mother, your sister, and your brother, nay, even your father, all have repeatedly said it was your way with everybody." "They are mistaken, however, and I own I have often mistaken a transient degree of liking for love, which I never felt, no, never, till I saw you. For several virtues have I liked several women, never any with so full soul, but some defect in her did quarrel with the noblest grace she owed, and put it to the foil. But you, oh you, so perfect and so peerless, were created of every creature's best." "There now," said Celestina, "that is exactly what I complain of. There is no rational conversation with you, capable as you are of adorning it. But, as Arabella very truly says, you do nothing but make speeches out of Otway or Shakespeare." "Arabella did not say I made speeches, but that I made love. And I make love because I feel it to an excess which is dreadful, because I know, and have known from the beginning, that it is hopeless. But as this hurts nobody but myself, I don't see why it should displease you, or why you should affect to misunderstand, or attempt to laugh off a passion which, whatever may be its effect on me, can never disturb your tranquillity or that of your fortunate lover." Celestina, finding him thus serious, thought it would be better, and indeed more generous, not to pretend ignorance of his meaning, and to reason with rather than rally him. She therefore dropped the gayer tone with which she began the conversation, and said gravely, "Mr. Montague, I will not affect then to misunderstand you. I am undoubtedly honoured by your partiality, and very much concerned if it is the source of present pain to you. Let it become rather a source of pleasure to us both, by reducing it to that generous and disinterested friendship which I may return with satisfaction. And for those warmer sentiments, which you now suppose are entirely diverted from any other object, seek one who can deserve and return them, and spare me, I beseech you, the pain of believing, even for a moment, that I have brought solicitude and suffering into any part of a family to which I am so much obliged. I need not tell you my situation. You know it is a very comfortless and a very uncertain one. Perhaps I may never see Mr. Willoughby again, or if I do, perhaps I may see him the husband of another. But in either case my attachment to him is unalterable, and were I sure to-morrow that we are divided, never again to meet, I should only think of submitting in such a way as would least wound him to a blow which I am sure he will not voluntarily give me, but never of running the hazard of making unhappy some equally worthy man by giving to importunity what I can never give to love. For my heart has been Willoughby's ever since I knew I had one, and it will be his till I remember it no longer." Montague gave no other answer to this than a deep sigh; and Celestina, pausing a moment to recover herself from the emotion her words had occasioned, went on, "You love quotations, and undoubtedly recollect, though perhaps from an author I ought not to quote, these words, Il n'y a point d'homme pour celle qui aime, son amour est plus, tous les autres sont moins." Montague now impatiently interrupted her. "You need not," said he, "thus refine on the cruelty with which you tell me that you can never throw away a thought on me. I knew it before; and in the wildest paroxysms of that passion which I glory in feeling and in cherishing, I never dared flatter myself that you would. Yet, perhaps even this fortunate Willoughby himself, this happy man, who may neglect you, leave you for another, and yet still be beloved, is not more capable of an ardent, a sincere affection than I am. If he leaves you for ever, good God, even if he entirely deserts you, you will still love him. Even then no other would have any hope." "None," said Celestina, "for then I will never marry. But, my good friend, this is an uneasy subject to us both. Let us then never resume it. Allow me to offer you my friendship and my esteem, and to assure you that this sudden partiality, which believe me you will soon and easily conquer, is the only subject on which I cannot listen to you with pleasure." They were now so immediately before the parlour windows that Montague, who saw the family assembled there at tea, dared not give way to what he felt, but asked her, in a lower voice, when she went. She told him the day after the morrow. Again he sighed, and when they got into the hall, turned towards his own little study, which was on the same floor, while Celestina went to join the party in the parlour, where she found Mr. Bettinson, whom she understood was now the professed lover of Miss Thorold, and so entirely did he now occupy the attention both of her and her mother, that they hardly noticed the entrance of Celestina. She took, however, the earliest opportunity of a pause in their conversation to signify her design of going on the following Thursday. Miss Thorold contented herself with coldly saying she was sorry to lose her so soon; and her mother, even less civil, as her husband was not by, said, "And pray, Mr. Morney, where are you going?" "To London, madam." "To London! Bless me! And pray who are you going to there?" "To a Mrs. Elphinstone, I believe, ma'am." "You believe! And pray when do you go?" "On Thursday, madam." "And alone?" "No, madam." "Not alone? Then who do you go with?" "With Mr. Cathcart, madam." "Oh, with Mr. Cathcart. And pray how do you go? In the stage?" "No, madam," replied Celestina, blushing at the indelicacy with which all these questions were asked before a stranger. "How then, pray?" "In post chaises, madam." "Huh! Post chaises are expensive." Here she stopped, being unable to find any other questions, or rather not daring to ask any more, as her husband and eldest son that moment came in with Captain Musgrave. Celestina, however, interpreted the look she put on as saying, "No matter how you go, so long as you do go," and again she congratulated herself on the resolution she had taken. Chapter 8. Volume 2, Chapter 9 of Celestina. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Celestina, by Charlotte Turner Smith, Volume 2, Chapter 9. Celestina, finding that Montague Thorold did not join the party, constrained herself to stay with them, lest it should be imagined they were together. Captain Thorold, as if he took advantage of his brother's absence, sat down by her, and began in a half-whisper to make her some of those speeches, between a sneer and a compliment, which always confused and distressed her. Soon after tea, however, Montague came in, and then, the evening being rainy, cards were proposed, to which his mother desired him to sit down, while Celestina, saying she had a few preparations to make for her journey, which she might as well begin in time, went away, nobody asking her to take a seat at the card-table. She was no sooner gone than Mrs. Thorold, addressing her eldest son, said, "So, Edmund, we are to lose your father's visitor at last, my dear." "Are we?" said he carelessly. "What, is her intended come back?" "Oh, no," replied his mother. "The young lady is going to London, it seems." "Lord, ma'am," cried Bettinson, "I'll tell you what Musgrave and I'd heard t'other day. Didn't we, Muzzy?" "Faith, I don't know whether we did or no, Jacky boy, till you tell me what it was we heard." "Why, we heard, Lord, why, 'twas that night we drank tea and supped, you know, with that there family of the Killigrews. We heard that Mr. Montague Thorold was a-going to be married to this Mr. Morning, and that Mr. What-d'ye-call-him, he that was to have had her, had given Mr. Montague a living to take her off his hands." Either the purport of this speech, or the manner in which it was delivered, threw Captain Thorold and his friend Musgrave into bursts of laughter, which they very freely indulged; but poor Montague turned pale, and trembled with vexation, while Mrs. Thorold, pursing her mouth and drawing herself up, said, "Pray, Mr. Bettinson, where did you say you heard this story? Pray, Edmund, what do you laugh at? I say, Mr. Bettinson, pray, was it at Mr. Killigrew's you heard this absurd story?" "Lord, yes, ma'am, and upon my soul I've heard it elsewhere. Why, Musgrave, don't you remember? Why, half the people at Exeter, I am sure, have talked to me about it." "I am very sorry for it," rejoined the old lady. "People give their tongues strange liberties, methinks. My son, I can assure them, will never, at least with mine and his father's consent, form any such connection. What, with a foreigner, an alien, as one may say, brought up upon charity, and I dare say not very honourably born? Or how did Mrs. Willoughby get her so easily from her own country? People of fashion don't part with their children to strangers. For my part, I would be very civil to a young woman in distress, as 'twas Mr. Thorold's whim to have her here for a little time. But I am very sorry it has given rise to any such report, which I beg the favour of you gentlemen to contradict. A living, indeed! Is it very likely that Montague Thorold should accept of a living with such an encumbrance, or on any such conditions?" "But, madam," cried Captain Thorold, as he dealt his cards, "what think you if poor Montague avows his penchant for the lady, and talks of dying without her instead of getting a living with her?" "Think!" replied his mother, reddening with anger. "Why, think that he is a fool, and that you are very little better for encouraging a silly boy in such nonsense." "Nay, madam," cried the captain, "I am sure I don't encourage him. I was only pitying him, as one naturally does all gentle youths who are crossed in love." Arabella, who knew that her mother sometimes suddenly threw off her everyday character to appear in one far less amiable, when unchecked by Mr. Thorold, now feared that she might give way to one of these fits of ill humour and exhibit a scene before Mr. Musgrave and Mr. Bettinson which might give them no very favourable idea of the family temper. She therefore gave her brother Edmund a hint to forbear pushing the conversation any farther. He desisted. The game went in favour of Mrs. Thorold, and in the pleasure of winning 5 shillings she forgot for that time the displeasure she had conceived against her youngest son. Celestina was in the meantime preparing for her journey. She had nothing now but her clothes to pack up, for her books and her drawing cases were at Alveston, where Cathcart besought her to let them remain a little longer, promising that if events were finally determined otherwise than he was still willing to hope, he would take them all from thence and send them to her whithersoever she might desire. She wished most earnestly the next day over, for she had now learned to dread more than before some extravagance on the part of Montague Thorold, for whom, notwithstanding the trouble she had received from his continual persecutions, she could not altogether withhold her pity and her esteem. In his figure he resembled his father, whom she had so much reason to regard with grateful affection, and his faults were merely those of youth and a vivid imagination. Whether his partiality to her was of a permanent or transitory nature, it was pretty certain that it now gave him pain, of which Celestina could not consider herself as the cause without desiring to alleviate or rather to end it. At supper, however, she learned with great satisfaction that Mr. Thorold and his 2 sons were engaged out for the whole of the next day, and were to leave home early in the morning. She fancied, from several remarks she made in the course of the evening, that this was purposely contrived; and the eyes of Montague, though he dared not otherwise speak, told her how cruelly he suffered from an arrangement which would deprive him of almost all the opportunities of speaking to her which her short stay might yet afford him, though he saw that his mother remarked all his looks, and was restrained only by the fear of offending his father from openly avowing the anger she had conceived. He could not forbear watching every turn of Celestina's countenance, and, when he bade her good night at the door, sighing deeply, and saying in a low whisper, "At what time do you go on Thursday?" "Early, I hope," replied she, and to avoid any farther questions hastened away. The next day passed quietly enough, for Mrs. Thorold, sure of being delivered from a visitor who had never been agreeable and was now uneasy to her, thought it as well to be tolerably civil to her; and Arabella, who thought very little about anything at present but securing her conquest over the heart of Mr. Bettinson, was hardly conscious that she was with them. Late in the evening the gentlemen returned, but Celestina had left the parlour before their arrival, on pretence of going early to bed that she might be ready the next day for Mr. Cathcart, whom she had appointed to meet her in a post-chaise at 6 o'clock. She took leave of Mrs. Thorold and her daughter therefore this evening, who received her thanks and adieus with great formality and no kindness. Very willingly would she have escaped bidding farewell to Montague Thorold the next morning, but she feared it would be impossible. Mr. Thorold had told her he should himself put her into the chaise, and he always rose so early that this, she knew, would not put him out of his way. As soon as her window was opened in the morning, which was almost as soon as it was light, she saw Montague Thorold standing under it. He kissed his hand to her when he perceived her, and looked so dejected that she could not see him without concern. She was very soon dressed, and went down into the parlour, where he no sooner saw her than he came to her. "You are ready even before the time, so impatient are you to leave us?" said he in a mournful voice. "Ah, Mr. Mornay, this house then will never again be blessed with your presence." "Indeed, sir, I hope to see it very frequently again, and shall always be happy to hear of the health and welfare of its inhabitants. But is your father in his study? I must see him before I go." "Do not, Celestina," said Montague very gravely, "do not so industriously try to deprive me of this last poor moment. Yet a little, and my unfortunate, my despised attachment will trouble you no more." "You are mistaken, Mr. Montague," replied Celestina. "Any circumstance that you have occasion to deem unfortunate will trouble me long, wherever and whatever I may be. Pray, therefore, for my sake, as well as for your own, exert your excellent understanding, and conquer this unlucky partiality towards a person who, whatever may be her sense of your worth, or her gratitude for your good opinion, can never return it otherwise than by esteem and good wishes." "I had rather you would hate, detest, and drive me from you," cried he, starting up and going to the window. "'Twould be less cruel than this gentle reason, which I know to be just, but which I cannot obey. And yet indeed, Celestina, I have no hope. I am not quite frantic enough to suppose there can be any for me. All I ask is to be permitted to be miserable, and that, after all, you cannot prevent. Yes, there is yet another favour I would solicit, though I know you will not grant it." "Anything I can do without impropriety," replied Celestina, "I certainly will do." "I do not know," said he, in a depressed and solemn voice, "what you may call propriety or impropriety, but the favour I would solicit is to be allowed to write to you. Nay, don't interrupt me with a refusal before you hear me. To be allowed to write to you, so long as I confine my letters to literary subjects only, and that once or twice a year you would acknowledge the receipt of my letters." "My dear sir," cried she, smiling, "you would be weary of this project long before the first half year had elapsed. Had you never talked to me of I know not what particular regard, there might have been no impropriety in this, and I am sure the pleasure and advantage would have been wholly mine. But after the extravagantly gallant things you have said, how can I—" "If I infringe the articles of our agreement," said he, "then send my letters back." "But tell me," cried Celestina, interrupting him in her turn, "tell me what good can this possibly do you?" "Good!" replied he. "You are not yourself insensible of a tender attachment to Willoughby, and yet ask what good it can do to be admitted to write to a beloved object. Good! Why, it will be the softener, the sweetener of my existence. While I am writing to you, I shall forget that I am never to see you. I shall forget everything but the pleasure of knowing that you will read what I am writing, that your hands will unfold my letter, your eyes pass over the traces of my pen, that sometimes I may amuse or interest you, and at others, perhaps, raise in your bosom a compassionate sigh for my silent, my unhappy love. Besides, I shall by that means always know where you are. Softi che intracci almeno di mia perduta parce, venga il pensier seguace sull'orme del tuo pie, sempre nel tuo cammino, sempre m'avrai vicino, e tu, che sai se mai, ti soverai di me. Celestina had no time to answer this otherwise than by saying that if he had sagacity enough to find out where she was, he possessed more than she did, who could not even guess where she might be. He answered that he could always know of Cathcart, and before she could urge the many objections she saw to his request, the chaise, with Cathcart in it, drove up to the door, and at the same moment Mr. Thorold came to them. He appeared sincerely concerned that she was going from him, desired her again to write to him, and while he was hastening breakfast, which he insisted upon her taking before she went, Vavasor rode into the courtyard, and giving his horse to his servant, came into the room also. Celestina, who knew that Cathcart had informed him of her resolution to go, had felt some surprise that he had not called upon her the day before to express his approbation and inquire how she intended to dispose of herself; but he was so volatile and inconsiderate that she thought it not impossible that he might have forgotten on Wednesday what he so vehemently urged on Monday, and she now rather wished he had, as she saw Mr. Thorold was very little pleased either with his present visit or the manner in which he addressed her, without taking either of him or his son quite so much notice as the laws of civility required. Celestina had frequently remarked the extreme inattention and disregard which, as Vavasor felt, he never chose to take the trouble of concealing, for the opinions of those to whom he was indifferent, and he was indifferent to 3/5 of the world, and not very solicitous about the rest, unless for a very few friends, whom he loved. He disliked the Thorolds, without knowing or inquiring of himself why he disliked them, and eager and solicitous only about Celestina, he hardly gave her time to address herself to them, or return their invitation to partake of their breakfast by the usual speech. A party who seemed so little pleased with each other, Celestina thought could not too soon separate. She therefore hastily drank her tea, and telling Cathcart she was ready, she gave the elder Mr. Thorold her hand, and thanked him, not without emotion, for all the kindness he had shown her. She then wished Montague Thorold health and happiness, desired him to offer her compliments and acknowledgments to his mother, sister, and brother, and then, Mr. Thorold leading her, and Montague walking silently on her left hand, she went out and stepped into the chaise. Cathcart followed her, and Vavasor went round to speak to her at the opposite side. "You did not wish me good morrow," said he, "and therefore I suppose you foresee that I intend going with you part of the way." Celestina had no time to answer, for Mr. Thorold offering his hand once more to bid her adieu, she gave it to him, saying, "Adieu, dear sir, 1,000 thanks and good wishes." Montague, who stood by his father, at that moment caught her eye, and there was on his countenance an expression of sorrow which affected her so much, that under the sudden impulse of concern and pity, she held out to him the hand his father let go. "Farewell, Mr. Montague," said she. He seized it eagerly, and held it as if he would never part from it more. But Cathcart at that moment, bowing to the gentleman, and bidding the postillion drive on, he was compelled to release it, though it was with a sigh as if his heart was half broken, and when the chaise drove off, instead of following it with his eyes, he turned away and went into his own room, unable either to see Celestina go or Vavasor following her. The concern she felt for him kept her silent the greatest part of the way to the cottage near old Winnington's, where Jessie was to meet them. Cathcart, who was unhappy at the necessity of parting from his wife, was not disposed to interrupt her, and though Vavasor now and then rode up to the door of the chaise and talked, she was not in spirits to answer the gay nothings with which he addressed her. The meeting with Jessie was more in unison with her feelings. Jessie threw herself into the arms of her benefactress, from whom she had been so long divided, and who she now saw only for a moment before they were to be separated for a yet longer time. Neither of them could say much, for their hearts were full. But had they been disposed for conversation, Vavasor, who felt only pleasure in having got Celestina away from the Thorolds, was very little inclined to give them an opportunity, but in his rattling way rallied Jessie and then Celestina, whom he teased about Montague Thorold and his father, one of whom he called her pedant and the other her priest, till she was half angry. Cathcart at length, however, prevailed upon him to leave the friends alone, and as they walked together before the door of the cottage, he inquired whether he had any commands in London. "Oh, none, I thank you," replied Vavasor, "for I shall be there myself almost as soon as you. Pray, where does Miss de Mornay intend to lodge?" Cathcart declared himself entirely ignorant, and then, for the first time, from some expression or look of Vavasor's, he suddenly entertained a notion that there was something more than friendly solicitude for Willoughby's betrothed wife in the eager and assiduous attentions of Vavasor, and he determined from that time to remark more narrowly his behaviour to her. "You do not intend to set out for London to day, sir?" inquired Cathcart. "Yes, I do," answered Vavasor. "That is, I just ride back and make my bow to those honest humdrum Cranfields, and then I am off for Okehampton, where I've told them I have business, and from thence I shall take 4 horses, and so come up with you, my good fellow, and your fair compagnon du voyage, before you reach Honiton." "And does Mr. Mornay know of your intentions, sir?" "No, for I know what scalping savages all the people about here are, and though there can be nothing in my attending her on behalf of Willoughby, yet on her account one would not set the clacks of the old cats within 20 miles round at work about it; and so I have made up a story of having a lawyer to meet about the affairs of my deceased aunt, who, luckily for the honour of my veracity, had a farm or 2 near Okehampton, which are now mine, and I intend the Cranfields, good matter of fact souls, shall fancy me carefully looking after my property, and settling repairs and renewals with Mr. Palmer the attorney." "You intend, no doubt, to tell Mr. Mornay of it, however, sir?" "Oh yes, now I see her safely out of the hands of her confessor, or else perhaps he would have put it into her head that I am not a fit escort for her, though I think, Cathcart, thou art so grave and sage that thou'lt make as proper a third to our party as his reverence himself. Come, never look so calamitous, but go and take leave of thy weeping wife, and let me and Celestina have a little conversation." Cathcart then went into the house, and Celestina presently afterwards came to Vavasor, who continued walking before it. "Has Cathcart told you my plan?" said he, before she could speak. "I intend to go to London with you from Honiton, where I shall be almost as soon as you." Celestina now recollected all Mr. Thorold had said to her. But the great friendship which had for so many years subsisted between Vavasor and Willoughby, and the undesigning openness of Vavasor's character, put all the suspicions he had raised to flight, even when this scheme seemed most strongly to corroborate those suspicions. "I had much rather you would not join us," said Celestina, "because, though I should certainly be glad of your company as well as Mr. Cathcart, yet perhaps 1,000 ill-natured things may be said about it." She was proceeding, when Vavasor interrupted her. "Yes, that's just the politics you have learned at the Thorolds. What does it signify to you what anybody says or thinks but Willoughby? And you know that he would put you himself into my protection on every occasion where he could not protect you himself. Come, come, Celestina, acknowledge that your old mentor has been warning you against having any acquaintance with such sad young rakes as Vavasor." "If you think so," replied Celestina, "you undoubtedly know that he has reason for his precaution; and as for his calling you what I always fancied you rather piqued yourself upon being, I don't see why my mentor, as you term him, should give you offence by that." "Rake as I am, however," answered he, "curse me if I would do a dishonourable thing towards George. No, by heaven, not if I were dying for love of you." "I believe you, indeed," said Celestina, "and such perfect confidence I have in your honour, that I should trust myself with you as with a brother." "And never, you dear candid angel," interrupted he, "never shall you repent that confidence. But I tell you very plainly, that though I am upon honour with Willoughby, I am not so with those Thorolds, and can allow nobody else to usurp that favour, which perhaps I might have taken it into my head to dispute even with my friend George himself, if he had not made out a very early and almost an hereditary claim to you. As it is, however, I have no pretensions for myself, but I am confoundedly jealous for him. And now I have got you out of the way of that prating, piping, poetical pedant, that Montague Thorold, I shall be quite easy when I see you situated where you are not very likely to meet with him again. So you won't oppose my meeting you on the road. Until then, my sweet friend, adieu." He then, without waiting for an answer, ran to his horse, which his servant was leading about, and mounting it, was out of sight in an instant. Cathcart and Jessie then came towards Celestina, and the latter, hanging on her neck, could hardly prevail on herself to bid her farewell, while Celestina, melting into tears, kissed her, and willing to shorten a scene so uselessly painful, stepped into the chaise, where Cathcart, having taken again a tender leave of his wife, immediately followed her, and they took the road that led across the commons to the turnpike. End of chapter 9. Volume 2, Chapter 10 of Celestina. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Celestina by Charlotte Turner Smith. Volume 2, Chapter 10. The road they were travelling led along the side of Alveston Park for near a mile and a half. Celestina had never passed it before but on the day when Mr. Thorold had taken her to his house, and then she had been so lost in mournful contemplations as hardly to notice whither she went. Now, however, the profound silence she had fallen into on parting from Jessie was suddenly broken by an exclamation, for on looking up she saw one of the park gates and cried, "Alveston, is it not? Oh, yes, I see it is. There is the house." Cathcart answered that it was, and after another short silence Celestina said, "To anybody but you, Cathcart, I should be afraid of betraying my weakness. But you are now in place of a brother to me, and knowing my situation, will indulge my regret. I have a strange fancy to get out and go up to that tuft of beech trees on the brow of the hill. It is not far. I shall not be gone long. Will you wait for me?" "My time is yours," replied he. "But will you allow me to observe that it is perhaps wiser to endeavour to conquer this useless regret than to indulge it?" "I know it would be wiser," answered Celestina, "but alas, we are not always able to be wise. I think I shall be easier when I have once more taken of that spot where I have often been so happy, a last adieu." "Heaven forbid it should be the last!" cried Cathcart, as he assisted her to leave the chaise. "I foresee many, many happy days for you yet, when you will be mistress of that house." "Ah, dear Cathcart," returned Celestina, half smiling through the tears that filled her eyes, "how happy a convert shall I be to the doctrine of second sight if your prophecy should ever be fulfilled. But no, I feel too certainly that this is the last time I shall ever behold this dear place." She then went into the park over the stepping stile, and walking about half a quarter of a mile, reached the group of beech trees which shaded a high knoll in the park, from whence the house, half concealed by intervening wood, appeared to great advantage. It was now the beginning of May, and the trees under which she stood were just coming into leaf, while others scattered over the park were many of them of the most vivid green, contrasted by the darker shade of fir and cypress mingled among them. One of the trees of this clump was marked by Willoughby with her name, his own, and his sister's, and the date. It was 5 years since, and the bark had grown rough and knotted round the scars, but the letters still remained. It was to revisit this well-known memorial that Celestina had been anxious, and now she could hardly bear the thoughts of leaving it. She recollected every trifling circumstance that happened when Willoughby cut those letters. The clothes he wore and his very look were again present to her, while in the breeze that sighed among the trees she fancied she heard the sound of his voice, and that he pronounced the name of Celestina. In this state of mind she had almost forgotten that Cathcart waited for her, till a herd of deer ran bounding by her, and looking up, she saw following them in mimic race several horses which grazed in the park. There was among them a favourite little mare, which Willoughby had been fond of from a boy. It had always carried him to Eton, and been the companion of all his boyish sports, and when it became old, had been turned into the park in summer and carefully sheltered in winter. While Mrs. Willoughby lived, it had been accustomed to be fed with bread once or twice a day from her hand, from her daughters or Celestina's; and since her death the old servants in the house, with whom it was a sort of contemporary, had accustomed it to the same indulgence, to which it had become so habituated that on sight of any of the family it went towards them to be fed. This creature therefore no sooner saw Celestina's clothes fluttering among the trees than it left its companions and came neighing towards her. Celestina fancied the animal remembered her. She caressed it fondly, and with tears in her eyes and a deep sigh, cried, "Ah, Fanchette, you recollect then your old friend, when perhaps your still beloved master is trying to forget her, and may already have succeeded but too well." She found herself too much affected with this idea, and turning her swimming eyes towards the house, the contrast between what she now was and what, hardly a month since, she expected to be, the fearful apprehension that Willoughby had suddenly become a convert to avarice and ambition, and that Miss Fitzhaman, who had the power to gratify both those passions, would soon possess the place where she had fondly hoped to constitute the happiness of his life, whose happiness was dearer to her than her own, all crowded with cruel force on her mind, and feeling her sensations become more and more painful, she tore herself from the spot which had so forcibly presented them, Fanchette still following and importuning her to be fed. She walked slowly towards the park gate, and saw Cathcart, who began to be uneasy at her stay, coming to meet her. He understood the nature of her sensations too well to make any inquiries, but offering her his arm, in silence led her toward the chaise. Before she ascended the steps of the stile, she turned once more to look at the horse, kissed the sensible animal as it licked her hands, and pronouncing a half-stifled and tremulous "Adieu, Fanchette," she got as hastily as she could into the chaise, and desired Cathcart to order the postillion on quickly. "Since I must go," said she, "I would be soon out of sight of this place, for I find I cannot bear it." "I feared, indeed," replied Cathcart, "it would too much affect you." Both then returned to their former silence, while Celestina, as her thoughts went back to past pleasures, and as her heart felt all the bitterness of disappointed hope, indulged herself without restraint in the sad luxury of sorrow. She no longer saw the objects she passed, or thought of whither she was going. But Alverstone was still present to her eyes, and she saw Willoughby wandering among its shades as if looking for lost happiness, and returning discontented to his house, whence the sullen magnificence and arrogant superiority of his haughty heiress had driven all domestic comfort. She heard him sigh forth too late his regret, and lament that for advantages he could not enjoy he had relinquished the competence he might have possessed with the tender attachment and grateful affection of his Celestina. Tears fell slowly down her cheeks as these distressing images presented themselves, and insensibly the tender adieu she had taken of the place, the tender wishes she had formed for the lamented friend and lover to whom it belonged, arranged themselves into verse, and produced the following Sonnet. Farewell, ye lawns, by fond remembrance blest, as witnesses of gay unclouded hours, where, to maternal friendship's bosom pressed, my happy childhood passed amid your bowers. Ye wood walks wild, where leaves and fairy flowers by spring's luxuriant hand are strewn anew, rocks, whence with shadowy grace rude nature lures, o'er glens and haunted streams, a long adieu. And you, O promised happiness, whose voice deluded fancy heard in every grove, bidding this tender, trusting heart rejoice in the bright prospect of unfailing love, though lost to me, still may thy smile serene bless the dear lord of this regretted scene. This disposition of mind, mournful as it was, afforded Celestina so much melancholy indulgence, that it was very reluctantly she was roused from it by their reaching Honiton, where she was glad to find Vavasour not yet arrived; for though she was sensible of the friendly interest he took in whatever related to her, and imputed it to no other motive than regard for Willoughby and pity for her own situation, there was an impetuosity in his manner and a freedom in his discourse which, though it did not offend her because she knew it was his usual way with everybody, was yet often oppressive to her, and since Mr. Thorold's caution had become more so than before. She observed, too, that Cathcart was not pleased at his purpose of accompanying them to London, and had expressed more than once, in the little conversation they had together during their journey, his hope that she would find his sister, Mrs. Elphinstone, such a companion as might engage her to continue with her. Celestina, who was, perhaps, a little too fastidious in the choice of her company, from having in her early years had her taste set very high by Mrs. Willoughby, was becoming generally indifferent now, from the little expectation she formed of being gratified, and though her overcharged heart languished for the soothing pleasure of unburthening itself to such a friend as the simple and sensible Jessie, she knew it was very improbable that any one whom she might meet should replace her. She answered Cathcart, however, that she doubted not Mrs. Elphinstone's merit, since she was his sister, and was greatly prejudiced in her favour by Jessie's account of her. "But, my dear sir," said she, "it is I who have the greatest reason to doubt of my reception, and I have thought since, the plan we hastily formed a very wild one. Mrs. Elphinstone, occupied by her family, may have as little occasion for a companion as taste for an intruder into her domestic circle; and she may perhaps, on your recommendation, accept what her own inclination may be averse to receive. Besides, she has a husband of whom I know nothing, and to whom the presence of a stranger, when he expects only his wife and family, may be disagreeable. I own I have thought of a journey into the north with more pleasure than anything else can now give me, for it is the only part of this island I have not seen something of in those summer excursions which my dear Mrs. Willoughby was fond of making. But with whatever satisfaction my fancy has dwelt upon it, I ought not to think of it farther, at least till I have seen your sister." Cathcart repeated again and again his assurances of the happiness her company would bestow on his sister, and continued to lay plans for the accommodation of their journey, while Celestina could not but think with internal anguish on her very forlorn situation, compelled to solicit the friendship and protection of strangers, or remain alone, unfriended and unprotected. She blessed, however, again the fortunate chance that had brought her acquainted with Jessie and Cathcart, without whom her condition would be yet more desolate, and for once saw evidently the lasting good that had been produced by a transient evil, the troublesome impertinence of Mr. Jedwin. As they arrived at Honiton sooner than they expected, Celestina proposed going on as far as Axminster, 9 miles farther, before they dined. To this Cathcart consented, hesitating, however, a moment whether they ought not to wait for Vavasour. Celestina seemed averse to it, and said if there was any rudeness in their going on without him, she would herself be answerable for it. They proceeded therefore to Axminster, and were just set down to their dinner when Vavasour, at the expense of almost killing the 4 horses which drew him, arrived. His volatile humour never forsook him, and he seemed now unusually disposed to indulge it. He gave the most ludicrous account of the manner in which he had misled the curiosity of Mrs. Cranfield, by setting out very gravely for Okehampton, and then cried, "Oh, and I tell you who I met as I rode back to Cranfield's? Your languishing lover, Montague Thorold, looking, poor dog, so distant and so dismal. He was composing, I fancy, an elegy on your departure, for I rode almost against him in the cross lane that leads from old Thorold's grounds towards Cranfield Hall, and he had a paper in his hand, on which he was so intent that he did not see me, till I awakened him with a whoop, whoop, as if I had been in at the death. He started, and I was afraid, as I might have spoiled a thought, that he would feel some poetical indignation; but instead of that, he popped the paper into his bosom, as if he feared I should have seized it, and then, with as much humility as if I had been the head of his college, he pulled off his hat, and professing himself glad to see me, inquired where I had left you. I told him on your way to London, and that I was going back to Cranfield's, and we parted with the utmost politeness. Celestina, who had really a friendship for Montague Thorold, could not hear of his anxious solicitude for her without a mingled sentiment of regard and concern, which, as her face expressed every emotion of her heart, was immediately perceived by the quick and penetrating eyes of Vavasour. He did not spare her, but rallied her with more success than politeness on the influence this college lad, for so he chose to term him, had obtained over her. "Upon my word," said he, "I shall think it necessary to put Willoughby upon his guard a little." "And how do you know, sir," answered Celestina, "that Mr. Willoughby will thank you for it? Or, that admitting Mr. Montague Thorold was really more to me than a common acquaintance, which you do not seriously believe, how are you sure that your friend would not be rather pleased that the affections he may wish to be troubled with no more are transferred to another?" "Transferred!" exclaimed Vavasour. "You admit, then, that such a transfer is probable?" "Not probable at all, but certainly it would with most people be possible." "And if it were with you, I am convinced that Montague Thorold is not the man to whom Willoughby would wish them to be transferred." He could, however, have very little pretence, after having resigned them himself, to dictate to whom they should be given. "But of what use, Mr. Vavasour, is all this argument? Whether I shall ever see Willoughby again or no is very uncertain, but it is very certain that if I do not, I shall never marry at all." Vavasour saw he had gone too far, and Cathcart at that moment returning to them to say the chaises were ready, the conversation dropped for that time, Celestina peremptorily resisting the efforts Vavasour made to induce her to go at least the next stage, in the chaise with him. They reached Dorchester that evening, and Celestina, after a slight supper, complained of being a good deal fatigued with her journey, and going as soon as she could to her chamber, left the two gentlemen together. Vavasour, naturally unreserved, even to indiscretion, and seldom taking the trouble to conceal his sentiments, was totally off his guard when he had drunk 5 or 6 glasses of wine, and since Willoughby, who alone had the power to restrain any of his excesses, had been less with him, he had accustomed himself to take more than double that quantity when he either dined or supped. Celestina was no sooner gone, therefore, than he ordered in another bottle of claret, and before it was finished he had told Cathcart without reserve all that he thought. Taking occasion to toast Celestina, he said, "Tell me, Frank, what do you think of her? Is she not a charming girl?" "Most undoubtedly," replied Cathcart. "She appears so to me, who knows that her very lovely person is the least of her merit; to me, who owe her more than life, and who throughout mine shall have reason to bless the hour that first threw my Jessie in her way." "Yes, by heaven!" cried Vavasour, "she is an angel; and I cannot for my soul guess at this strange mysterious business of George's leaving her. For though it is a desperate undertaking for a man to marry at all, yet he had got over that, and doted upon her to a degree that I never imagined possible till I saw them together. I cannot understand it, and the more I think about it, the more incomprehensible it becomes. Tell me, Cathcart, do you think he will ever now marry her?" "My dear sir," replied Cathcart, I can only say with you that the more I think, the less I comprehend of the affair. I'll tell you, Frank, I am pretty well persuaded that he will never marry her; nay, that he has made up his mind to tie himself to the 15,000 a year and the Viscount's title, which are the appendages of his cousin. Yet why, unless he had fully determined against all the temptations that match offered him, why carry matters so far with Celestina? And who the devil could those two women be who it seems put the matter by and sent him off in such a hurry? I never could find out, replied Cathcart. He was himself the only person who knew, and of him, as he avoided all explanation, I could not inquire. What? Did you never ask whether they were young or old? I asked, but the people hardly saw their faces. They came in the evening and went away in the middle of the night, but from the little information I could make out, neither of them appeared young. I should have thought, for you fellows that affect principle are not always to be depended upon, that George had got into some filly scrape or other with some wench that he might have promised to marry. But any such entanglement might have been easily got rid of, without his flying away from Celestina, or even from his country. Well, there is no making it out, but I believe it is clear enough that Celestina will now never be his wife, and that being once ascertained, Cathcart, do you know she is the only woman upon earth whom I shall ever think of making mine? Yours, sir? exclaimed Cathcart. Ay, mine, sir. I own 'tis rather extraordinary that even my divine Celestina should make me meditate on matrimony, but such a wonder was worthy of her only, and she has effected it. I never was uneasy half an hour in my life about any woman till I saw her at Alveston, or rather till I became acquainted with her, for I have seen perhaps handsomer women, or at least those that were at first view more striking. Faith, I found myself growing so cursed foolish about her, that supposing her then to be on the eve of marriage with my friend George, I thought it best to fly for it, and by going back to my old haunts, you know my way, I got her out of my head a little, and could have seen her Willoughby's wife coolly enough. But the moment I heard he had left her, this confounded love, I suppose you call it, began to play the devil with me again, and I could not be easy, knowing the folks she was with, without coming down to see after her. However, Captain Thorold, it was that puffing fellow I was most afraid of, had not, I believe, the least interest. Nor will any man have it, I fancy, replied Cathcart. At least I am sure that nothing less than the certainty of Mr. Willoughby's marriage with another would for a moment detach her from the invariable affection she has for him. I even question if that would make any alteration in her heart, though it might in her prospects. Pooh, pooh! cried Vavasor. You have not studied women, I find. Celestina has too much spirit and too much sense to mope away her youth and beauty, and dwindle into the neglected ugliness of ancient maidenhood, because Willoughby did not know his own mind. Her pride, and she is not without it, will help her to get the better of an attachment which will only be a source of mortification to her. No, no, let me be once sure that Willoughby gives her up, and I don't think it very presumptuous to say that in a fortnight afterwards I carry her to Orkneybury, Mrs. Vavasor. Till then, however, sir, said Cathcart, till you are quite sure that all is at an end between Mr. Willoughby and Mr. Mornay, you will of course hold it a point of honour not to declare your intentions. It will distress her extremely if you do, for thinking of you as I know she thinks, she will conclude you are very certain that all ties are dissolved between them, or you would not address her in a way which, while those ties are undissolved, she will call a breach of honour towards your friend. Ay, that's all very true, replied Vavasor. But let her take care then how she shows a disposition to favour that sucking parson, that Montague Thorold. Though I'm willing to allow Willoughby the preference, I am by no means disposed to give the pass to such a greenhorn as that. And to tell you the truth, Frank, if I was sure she preferred him, I might commit some folly or other." "Well, sir," cried Cathcart, rising to wish him good night, "she is not likely to be in his way, and if she were, I am very certain Mr. Willoughby has nothing to fear from him. And as to yourself, you know, you agree that while he is in question, you are entirely out of it." Cathcart then left him to finish another bottle alone, and carried with him no very agreeable reflections. Notwithstanding all that had passed, he could not divest himself of the hope of seeing Celestina united to Willoughby, whom alone he thought worthy of her. His own competence and happiness, which they only had given him, would, he felt, be incomplete if both or either of them were unhappy, and unhappy he thought they must be if they lived not for each other. Whatever scheme therefore interfered with a union he so much desired, he felt as a sort of injury to himself; and though the extreme good humour, generous spirit, and gay temper of Vavasour made it impossible to dislike him, Cathcart was convinced, from the little he knew of his manner of life and his very free principles, that were Willoughby wholly set aside, he was a man with whom the sensibility and purity of mind of Celestina would never allow her to be happy. He foresaw, therefore, nothing but uneasiness for her in his intended pursuit of her, and thought with redoubled anxiety of her situation. As early the following morning as Vavasour could be prevailed upon to move, they renewed their journey, and about 6 o'clock that evening, having taken leave of Vavasour in Piccadilly, who took Cathcart's directions in order to be with them the next morning, Celestina was set down at the lodgings Mrs. Elphinston had removed to in Suffolk Street, Charing Cross. End of chapter 10. Volume 2, Chapter 11 of Celestina. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. Celestina by Charlotte Turner Smith. Volume 2, Chapter 11. Cathcart had given his sister notice of the arrival of Celestina, and therefore the joy with which Mrs. Elphinston received her brother and the lovely person to whom he had been so much obliged, was unallayed by the surprise she might have felt at the unexpected entrance of a stranger. Celestina was extremely pleased with her new acquaintance, and very soon forgot that she saw her for the first time. Her figure was very tall and thin, and would have had as much dignity as symmetry, but that an habitual though slight stoop seemed to bespeak oppression of spirit and the weight of many sorrows. Her face very much resembled that of Cathcart, but the bloom of youth and the glow of health were gone. Still it was interesting, though languid and faded. Her eyes were eminently beautiful, and there was an air of mild resignation over her whole countenance particularly touching, which, even in her most cheerful moments, bespoke her rather studying how to bear the evils she seemed to foresee than capable of enjoying the passing pleasure. Sorrow had left on her expressive features marks of its cruel power, and had anticipated the hand of time; for though she was not yet 30, she appeared 4 or 5 years older, and her dress offered nothing to undeceive the imagination, for it was so plain that nothing but its extreme neatness and finer linen distinguished her from women in the humblest rank of life. Her manners, however, would, in any dress or any situation of life, have marked her for a well-educated woman, and her voice was particularly pleasing to Celestina, who had been wearied by the harsh monotony of Mrs. Thorold or the affected lisp of her daughter. Celestina had not been an hour in company with Mrs. Elphinston before she not only determined on going to Scotland with her if it were practicable, but felt so uneasy in the fear of a disappointment that she wished to have it immediately discussed. Cathcart, who easily understood her, then began to talk the matter over with his sister, and found that from the hint of it which he had before given her, she had been assiduously removing every objection that could arise. She answered for Mr. Elphinstone, whom Cathcart had before described to Celestina as good-natured even to a fault, and so fond of society as to have owed great part of his misfortunes to a passion for it; and Celestina, willing to be convinced of what she wished to believe, no longer hesitated. Nothing then remained but to prepare for their departure, which was fixed to be at the distance of 2 days. Cathcart undertook every preparation, and having settled everything as far as it could be that evening, he took leave of Celestina, for whom Mrs. Elphinstone had procured an apartment in the same house, and went to a coffee-house where he had bespoke a bed, promising to be with them the next morning. Celestina, early on that morning, arose to write the letter she had long meditated to Willoughby. She was now able to give such reasons for her quitting Mr. Thorold as he could not disapprove, and though he might perhaps think her present plan a strange one, he would be easy, she thought, in the reflection that it was attended with no personal danger, and that she was with Cathcart's sister. One only objection now struck her, and that was the length of time which must elapse before she could receive his letters. But on the other hand, if the strange obstacles to their meeting remained, it was uncertain whether he would write to her, and if they were removed, she hoped that he would fly to her with equal eagerness, whether she was in Devonshire or in the extreme parts of Scotland. She collected, therefore, everything her tenderness suggested to make Willoughby easy about her if he still loved her, and was shedding involuntary tears over that painful doubt, when, as she had just concluded her letter, Vavasor very abruptly entered the dining-room, where Mrs. Elphinstone had not yet taken her seat, being detained by the care of her 4 children, whom she attended to entirely herself. Vavasor entered with the gay confidence of a welcome visitor, but was a little disconcerted by the languid coldness with which Celestina received him, and by the air of melancholy she assumed, and the traces of recent tears which he observed on her cheeks. He inquired if she was not writing to Willoughby, and on her answering "yes," asked her what she had said to him of her future intentions as to residence. "I have told him," replied she, "that I am going to Scotland." "To Scotland? Impossible! You are laughing at me." "Indeed I am going to Scotland," said she, "and I thought you had known it." "To Scotland? No, I imagined you would take lodgings either in London or its neighbourhood, and wait for letters from George, which must soon be here, and be certainly decisive." "That is by no means certain," answered Celestina, "and whatever the purport of those letters may be, I may hear it there as well as here." Vavasor now inquired more minutely into her plan, against which he first levelled his whole powers of ridicule, as being wild, romantic, unpleasant, and productive of nothing but disappointment and fatigue. But finding Celestina proof against all the ludicrous lights in which he could represent it, he became serious, and vehemently inveighed against the folly and hazard of a journey to the most desolate and dreary country of Britain, to reside with people whom she did not know, and who were themselves only adventurers on a wild and speculative scheme that would probably be abortive. He represented very forcibly the discomforts she must meet with, and the little pleasure or knowledge which the view of such a country could offer to counterbalance them. But she was as indifferent to local circumstances as to the ridicule of those who would, he said, laugh at her pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Columba. And he had exhausted almost all his arguments without making any alteration in her resolution, when the entrance of Mrs. Elphinstone and Cathcart obliged him to desist. From their conversation he had the mortification of hearing that everything would be ready for their journey the next day but one, and of finding that Cathcart never supposed he meant to object to any plan of Celestina's, who was entirely mistress of her actions. Unused to any opposition, Vavasour could hardly brook it, even from those who were his equals; and though he had hitherto behaved to Cathcart as if he had considered him as such, his spirit now revolted at what he thought the opposition of an inferior and a dependent. He became silent during breakfast, and was very evidently displeased; and as soon as he could he desired Cathcart to walk with him for half an hour in the park. He there remonstrated very warmly against Celestina's going, and urged, among many other reasons, the objections Willoughby would make to it. Cathcart, convinced from this conversation that it was necessary for her to be removed as far as possible from Vavasour, kept his temper, and referred his impetuous opponent to Celestina herself. He went back, therefore, to Mrs. Elphinstone's lodgings to make another effort, but had the additional mortification of finding the ladies gone out to make purchases, and all his subsequent attempts that day to see them were abortive. The next he attended very early at their door, and saw a chaise there, into which he found them almost instantly stepping, to dine at Richmond with an old relation of Mrs. Elphinstone's and Cathcart's, of whom it was necessary for the former to take leave; and all Vavasour's disregard for forms could not authorise his intruding himself upon them there. He called in the evening in Suffolk Street, but they were not returned, and was there again at 10 o'clock, and told they were gone to bed. At daybreak the next morning he proposed to beset the door, though almost hopeless now of detaining Celestina. The habits of life, however, he was accustomed to, and some additional wine drank the evening before to conquer his vexation, contributed to keep him long after daybreak from being on the watch, and on his arrival about 7 o'clock, he learned from Cathcart, who was just setting out for Devonshire with the two little girls and a servant he had hired to take care of them, that Celestina and his sister had been gone above 2 hours, and were probably many miles on the North Road. Vavasour received this intelligence with indignation and resentment, which Cathcart pretended not to observe; and busying himself in placing his little girls in the chaise and settling their baggage, he in a few moments wished Vavasour a good morning, and left him to curse his destiny at his leisure, which he did very liberally for some moments. And then determining to think no more of Celestina, he plunged, in order to forget her, into those scenes where he was certainly not apprehensive of meeting anybody like her; and with a party he formed there, he went in a few days to Orkneybury, his seat in Staffordshire, where he tried to persuade himself that he hated and despised all modest women, and never would give himself a moment's concern about one of that description again. Very differently did Montague Thorold sustain the loss of Celestina's company, and the cruel probability, amounting almost he believed to a certainty, that he should never see her again. While he remained at his father's house, which was hardly a week after her quitting it, he fed his unhappy love by collecting many little memorials of her, which he preserved as sacred relics with all the fond idolatry of romantic passion. A cambric handkerchief which she had dropped, marked by her own hands and with her own hair, was one of the principal of these, and in it he constantly kept folded up the sonnet, written with a pencil, which he steeped in milk to preserve the letters from being erased, a card on which she had sketched a landscape, and a profile which he attempted to make of her one evening by a shade, though his trembling hand and want of skill had deprived it of much resemblance, were added to the packet which he thus wore in his bosom, and which he so delighted in contemplating that he forgot all other claims upon his time, and regardless of what his family said or thought, passed whole days alone in the fields, or when he was with them, was reserved, silent, and restless. Mr. Thorold saw all this with great concern, but still flattered himself that absence, and returning again to his studies and his college friends, would insensibly wean him from the indulgence of a fruitless passion, and sometimes he entertained a vague and distant hope that if Willoughby resigned all pretensions to the hand of Celestina, the merit and attachment of Montague might have a claim to her gratitude and her affection. But of this he gave not the most distant hint to his son, and parted with him without naming Celestina, or seeming to notice the state of his mind in regard to her. Celestina in the meantime was journeying towards Scotland with Mrs. Elphinston and her 2 little boys. As Cathcart had hired a chaise to carry them to Edinburgh, where Elphinston was to meet them, they travelled slowly, but as the weather was delightful, and her companion became every day more agreeable to her, Celestina was in no haste to reach the end of her journey. Everything in this part of England was new to her, and since the fatal hour of her separation from Willoughby she had never been so calm as she now felt herself, though far enough from being happy. The oftener she read over the letters she had received from Willoughby, which were her constant companions, the more steadily she reflected on his principles and his character, more firmly she became persuaded that whatever was the cause of their separation, it was not owing to his preference of another, to idle caprice, or to any motive which should make her blush for his morals or his heart. In this reliance on the honour of the man to whom her heart was fondly devoted, she found so much consolation that she drove from her as resolutely as she could all those suspicions which had embittered her mind on the information Vavasour had given her. She thought it very possible that the Castlenorths were gone abroad, because Lord Castlenorth was never well in England, and his lady, of more consequence among the English in Italy than she could be in London, or even at Castlenorth, was much fonder of being looked up to there than in being lost in the crowd of those who were of equal or superior rank at home. Their daughter too affected foreign manners and foreign sentiments, and with the figure and countenance of a coarse English female peasant, assumed sometimes the animated vivacity of the Neapolitan beauty, and sometimes the insinuating languor of the Venetian, and when in England had very frequently declared her dislike of the people and the country, and expressed her wonder that those who could converse in any other should use the harsh and vulgar language of the English. That a family thus disposed should not remain in their native country, and above all, after the mortification they must have met with from Willoughby's rejection of their alliance, was not extraordinary. But Celestina endeavoured to persuade herself that though they were on the continent, it was with no intention of renewing their negotiation with him, to which their pride would never suffer them to stoop, and that, though he should meet them there, it would be on his part involuntary, and only as the nephew of Lord Castlenorth, by no means as the lover of his daughter. Notwithstanding all her arguments, however, and all her dependence on Willoughby's love and constancy, she was sometimes conscious of returns of suspicion and fear, and unable wholly to stifle the pangs she then felt, she endeavoured to think less of herself and more of others, and above all to interest herself for Mrs. Elphinston, who seemed every hour more worthy of her regard. In the course of their conversation she found that Mr. and Mrs. Elphinston, reduced as they had lately been in circumstances, had once been in a very different situation of life, and she could not resist the inclination she felt to learn what reverse of fortune had thrown them into the distressed condition which Jessie had described to her, and which had made a deep and painful impression on the generous sensibility of Celestina. But however her anxiety was excited, she had so much delicacy as to avoid wounding her new friend by showing it, unlike that very common description of people who love to inquire into the sorrows and misfortunes of others, not with any view to relieve or even to soothe them, but merely to gratify an impertinent curiosity, and to rise higher in their own idea by the comparison, while they cry like the Pharisee, "Lord, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, even as this publican." To an heart such as Heaven had bestowed on Celestina, there was something in misfortune not only respectable but sacred, and she behaved towards Mrs. Elphinston with infinitely more attention than she could ever prevail upon herself to show to Mrs. Thorold, amid all her bustle of affluence and her claims upon the veneration of the world from good dinners and rich connections. Mrs. Elphinstone, however, who was aware that Celestina knew part of her history, was very solicitous to relate to her the whole of it, conscious that in her opinion she should lose nothing, and that Celestina had in some measure a right to inquire into the life of a person to whom she had given her confidence, and who was a candidate for her friendship and her esteem. She waited therefore a fit opportunity the second day of their journey to drop something of her family, and seeing that Celestina wished to know more, she said, smiling, "It is something like the personage with whom we are presented in old romances, and who meet in forests and among rocks and recount their adventures. But you know, my dear Mr. Mornay, that I feel very much disposed to enact such a personage, and though it is but a painful subject, to relate to you my past life." "And do you know, dear madam," replied Celestina, "that no wandering lady in romance had ever more inclination to lose her own reflections in listening to the history of some friend who has by chance met her, lost in the thorny labyrinth of uneasy thoughts, than I have to listen to you." "Well, then," rejoined Mrs. Elphinstone, "you shall hear all that has befallen me, even from my girlish days. Mine has been a life, not marked, I think, with anything very extraordinary, but invariable ill fortune, which, though I could not escape it, I trust I have sustained with fortitude. But here," continued she, pointing to her children, "here are my little supporters. Without them, without feeling that they were a trust committed to me by Heaven, from my sacred attention to which, no personal sufferings, no care for myself, could exempt me even for a moment, I am afraid I should have tired long ago in the rude and various path I have trod. But my exordium will be longer than my history. My family are of Scottish origin. My father, one of its younger branches, was settled as a merchant in London, and was engaged in the American trade, by which he was making a respectable provision for his family of 3 daughters and 3 sons, of whom my dear Frank was the youngest, when the course of his business brought him acquainted with the family of Mr. Elphinston, who had possessions in the West India Islands. The father of Mr. Elphinston inherited some of these from his family, but, of a greater part, became possessed by purchases made of land in the islands ceded to England at the peace of 1762. They at first promised to answer his most sanguine expectations, and on the strength of those promises he quitted the West Indies, where he had lived many years on his own estate, and came to London, establishing his household in a style of expense more suitable to his imaginary than his real fortune. His family consisted of a wife who had never been in England before, and who brought with her all the pride she had boundlessly indulged in Antigua, 5 children, and as many negroes. A few years convinced Mr. Elphinston that he had reckoned somewhat too fast on his annual income, but he was not disposed to diminish the showy and expensive style in which he first set out, and had he himself thought of it, the opposition he was sure to meet with from his wife and children would have deterred him from any attempt to put a scheme of economy in practice. His daughters were most expensively educated and still more expensively dressed, their mother wisely making a point of their being always the best dressed girls in the school to which they were sent, though among their schoolfellows there were many children of the nobility. The 2 boys were placed at Westminster School, where the elder was soon distinguished for having more money and less understanding than any boy of his age, and where the tyrannical disposition which he had been suffered to exercise over the unfortunate black people among whom he had passed his childhood broke out in so many instances that he was as much hated for his overbearing temper as despised and laughed at for his ignorance and his vanity. The youngest, who is now my husband, was in everything the reverse of his brother, open, good-humoured, and undesigning, too gay and careless to think, too quick to learn, which, however paradoxical it may sound, is in many instances true. The boy who knows he can learn in half an hour a task which another cannot conquer in a day, is very apt to let alone learning it till application becomes too late. Alexander Elphinstone, however, was so much a favourite, that when he neglected to do his business, somebody or other was always willing to do it for him, and when his father took him from school to place him at an academy where he was to be qualified for a merchant, he was as much regretted as his brother was detested, who had now acquired in the school the name of Squire Squashy, which he never afterwards lost. It was about the year 1770 that Mr. Elphinstone, the father, in seeking for a counting-house to place his youngest son, was introduced to my father. The pomp with which the old gentleman was surrounded, the high style in which he accustomed himself to talk, the details of his estates, though some of them brought him every year in debt, his negroes, and his sugar-works, dazzled my father's eyes, who had been accustomed only to a plainer style of life, and less flattering views of profit. He was pleased with the thoughts of taking into his counting-house the son of a man so opulent, and when he saw the young gentleman himself, was immediately prejudiced in his favour. Elphinstone was then a tall boy of 16. His dark complexion was enlivened by black eyes full of spirit and vivacity, and his countenance, if not handsome, was expressive of an open and ingenuous mind. The premium which my father asked was agreed to, and young Elphinstone became one of our family, which consisted of my father, his second wife, by whom he had no children, my 2 sisters, and myself. For of my 3 brothers, one was placed at the Temple, another was gone to the East Indies, and the youngest, my dear Frank, was then at school. My mother-in-law was one of those common characters which are so difficult to describe unless it be by negatives. She was not ill-natured, she was not a woman of understanding, she was not handsome, she was not young, she was not well born or well educated; but my father, who had married her to take care of his family, and to put the £3,000 she possessed into his business, was well enough contented to see that she did not behave ill to his children, that she brought him no more, and that she had always a plain dinner ready for him when he came from 'Change, was satisfied with going on a Saturday to a country house at Clapton, near Hackney, and receiving the visits of the wives and daughters of traders like himself, and had been brought up with no higher ideas of elegance than what were answered by their society, or fancied any superior entertainment was to be found than what she enjoyed in the front boxes at a play twice a year, or in a Christmas attendance at Hackney Assembly. It is true that on these occasions she loved to be fine, to wear rich silks and good lace, to clean and exhibit her mother's rose diamond earrings, and to wear my father's picture by way of bracelet, fastened by garnets on her comfortable round arm. But these were indulgences about which he never contended, and was rather pleased that Mrs. and the Miss Cathcarts began to be considered as people of some consequence in the circle in which they moved, while he gradually obtained in the city the name of a warm man. I was not more than 11 years old when Mr. Elphinstone became a member of our family. One of my sisters was 4 years older, and the other a year younger, but my eldest sister, at about the age of 17, was married to a young West Indian of whom my father had the care, and went with him to settle in Barbadoes. My sister Emily and I grew up to consider Elphinstone as our brother, but I soon learned to think of him with particular partiality, and to grieve at the frequent occasions which my father had to complain of him. He was wild, eccentric, and ungovernable; sometimes rode away to races when he ought to have been settling with the grocers, for my father was now deeply engaged in the West India trade, and sometimes got into scrapes with his old schoolfellows, and was found at the watch-house instead of the counting-house; or if he attended those solemn meetings at which the price of freight or the quality of Osnaburgs was discussed, he turned the venerable persons of the old merchants and grocers into ridicule, and while they thought he was making calculations, was frequently drawing caricatures of them in all their majesty of wig, upon the leaves of his memorandum book. But with all this, he was so capable of business, so ready with his pen, and so perfectly master of accounts, that my father often said he could do more business in an hour than he himself could do in 3, and that if once he became steady, he would make a great figure as a merchant. His father, the elder Mr. Elphinston, found it convenient, after his son had been with us a year or 2, to cultivate very assiduously an acquaintance with our family. Mrs. Elphinston, who had reluctantly consented that her youngest son should be brought up a merchant, now condescended to visit us, and in her drawling way to attempt civility. The Miss Elphinstons were directed to forget the distance between Cavendish Square and Mincing Lane, and to visit us often, while we were of course mightily delighted to receive invitations to their routs, and to be admitted to add to the crowd which 4 or 5 times in a winter filled their rooms in Cavendish Square. Insensibly my good mother-in-law acquired a taste for what was then called the other end of town, and no longer contented with the gratifications of Haberdashers' Hall or the Crown and Anchor, which had once been the utmost limits of her ambition, she learned to sigh for the Soho assembly, for 25 tables, and the company of titled dowagers and yellow admirals. If this unfortunate mania seized her, it was not wonderful that it extended itself to us. Emily had a very fine voice, and the Miss Elphinstons had concerts to which she was invited. We both had learned among ourselves to act parts of plays. The Miss Elphinstons had at their house at Ealing a private theatre, and we were promoted to parts in their drama. Looking upon us as inferior to them in our persons, in our education, in our family, and in our fortunes, no idea of rivalry ever disturbed this intercourse, and insensibly we passed more time with them than we did at home, whither I should always have returned with murmurs and regret, if it had not been the only place where I could meet young Elphinston without witnesses, the only place where some folly of the moment did not seem to make him forget the preference he professed to give me. Such was the situation of the 2 families, when the eldest son of the Elphinstons, the gentleman who had been distinguished at Westminster by the appellation of Squire Squashy, arrived from a 12-months' tour in France and Italy, and with him a sort of tutor who had been sent with him at a very exorbitant salary. To all the native arrogance and invincible stupidity of his original character, this elder brother had added the pertness of fancied knowledge and the consciousness of travelled superiority. A more disgusting character could hardly be imagined. He was now not only above all the rest of the world, but infinitely above his own family. His mother was silenced by, "Good madam, how is it possible you should know?" His father, by a silent shrug of contempt and a disdain of argument; while his sisters, who piqued themselves upon their elegance and fashion, were ridiculed for being si bourgeois that they were hardly within the possibility of being made comme il faut. As to my sister and myself, who were with them when he arrived, he looked at us once through his opera glass, inquired who we were, and hearing we were the daughters of his father's merchant and lived in the city, he never, on any occasion that I can recollect, deigned to notice us again. Unhappily, the gentleman who had travelled and who still continued with him, saw with different eyes my poor little Emily, then not quite 15. He affected to be highly pleased with her singing, and undertook to give her instructions. He would teach us both French, and corrected our acting. We were invited to pass 2 months at Ealing, at a house which Mr. Elphinston rented, and to which his daughters had given the name of Cypress Grove, though not a cypress higher than a gooseberry bush was near it, and there we were to act plays, in which, though the elder Hope of the family declined taking a part and absented himself from the set entirely, his travelling friend, whose name was Beresford, was of great consequence, and Alexander Elphinston was permitted by my father to quit, on those occasions, the high counting stool and sharp desk for the throne of King Pyrrhus, or the triumphal car of his namesake Alexander. I will own that, young as I then was, being not quite 16, my childish heart was enchanted with these amusements, especially when he bore a part in them to whom that heart was already so fondly attached. Unsuspecting and artless, I dreamed not of the mischief which lurked under all this festive pleasure, and incapable of thinking for myself, I was a very insufficient guard to my sister, who was still younger and more thoughtless, yet to me was she entrusted, unless, which did not very often happen, my mother left the card table to be a spectator of the amusements of the younger part of the company. Emily, however, was always with me, but it is true that young Elphinston was always with me too, and in listening to him I heard not or attended not to the more dangerous conversation with which Mr. Beresford entertained my sister. He contrived most artfully to put her upon her guard against all confidence, which he knew must ruin his scheme, and the first idea I had of my poor Emily's misfortune was, when on awaking one morning I found she was already risen, contrary to her usual custom. I was not, however, alarmed till, on beginning to dress myself, I found the drawers where we kept our clothes were emptied of everything of hers. Even then I had only a confused idea of what had happened, till, in looking wildly round the room, I saw a note upon the table, which I opened in trembling astonishment, and read thus: "My dear sister, to avoid any arguments in regard to a step I was determined to take, I have said nothing to you that I meant to leave you. I hope you will forgive it, and assure yourself I am safe, and in the care of a man of strict honour, who will himself write to my father, and I do not know that I am accountable to anybody else but to him for my actions. You shall hear of me soon, when I shall have exchanged the name of Emily Cathcart for that of your still affectionate sister, Emily Beresford." My ideas were at once so painful and so confused that I lost all recollection for a moment, and running downstairs half dressed as I was, I asked in breathless agitation for my sister Emily. The servants who were up, for it was yet early morning, stared at me without comprehending my distress, and I found nobody disposed to attend to me till the younger Elphinston met me and eagerly inquired what was the matter. I put the note I held into his hand, sat down in the seat of a window, and burst into tears. He saw in a moment what my ignorance of the world had in some measure concealed from me, and knowing that Beresford was the last man in the world likely to marry, he knew that Emily was lost. Neither my father or his wife were then at Ealing, and he paused a moment on what could be done. He then endeavoured to console and reassure me, and went to his father and his mother to inform them of what had happened. The old gentleman came to me in a few moments, advised me to go immediately home and acquaint my parents, and sent a servant for a post chaise, in which he said his younger son should attend me. I hardly know how I left the house, but I remember Mrs. Elphinston did not appear, and that the young ladies expressed none of that concern which I thought I should have felt for the rest, had any one of them disappeared under circumstances so prejudicial to their fame. The travellers now arrived at Stilton, where they were to rest that night. It was late, and Mrs. Elphinston appearing a good deal fatigued, Celestina besought her to delay any further gratification of her curiosity till the next day. She then assisted her friend in giving her children their supper and putting them to bed, and after a short repast together they retired to rest in 2 beds in the same room, where the children were already asleep. CHAPTER XII.